Okay, so I'm going to now introduce our respondents. And I'll start from my immediate left, and that is Dr. Jonathan Sears. He's a professor in international development studies at Menno Simons College. He's been here since 2007. He teaches a variety of areas, including ethics, development theory, and aid policies. His background is in comparative politics and political thought. And his research looks at citizen identity in Francophone West Africa and is rooted in multiple political cultures and influenced by urban and rural livelihood activities. Then next to Dr. Akram-Lodhi is Paul Hagerman. He is the Director of Public Policy at the Canadian Food Grains Bank and is working in that position to improve Canadian aid policy with respect to agriculture. He has worked in a variety of related fields, including agricultural extension, education, and research in Canada and in several developing countries. And he has his master's degree from the University of Guelph in agriculture and rural development. And finally, on the end is Ms. Laura Rance, who is the editor of the Manitoba Cooperator and is a weekly business columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. She has been writing about agriculture, food, and rural issues for more than 30 years, and I imagine many of you read her column regularly. Thank you. Through her work, she has traveled to several countries, including in Africa, Europe, and South America. Laura grew up on a Manitoba farm and lives with her husband at an acreage near Carmen. So what I've asked the respondents to do is to take 3 to 5 minutes each, and so we'll have John speak, and then Paul, and then Laura, and then we'll give some time for Haroon to respond, and then we'll come to you with the opportunity for questions and comments. So, John, please get us started.
Thanks very much, Jerry, and thank you, Haroon, for a very stimulating presentation. It was very stimulating, and you really sucked me in when you started with population and where you led us. The one thing that I wanted to, or I think it's one thing I wanted to key in on is how something you said very near the end of your presentation that connected to something that Dr. Entz, I think, was very persuasive about in the first of this year's Esau lectures, and it's around the issue of the productionist paradigm connected to capital-intensive agricultural production and the genuine potential and preferability of agroecological food production. So after that talk by Dr. Entz a couple months ago, I was more persuaded than ever that makes sense in terms of the food science. It seems to me that a couple of things arise out of your remarks that seem to be barriers. Forgive me if I kind of operate at a bit of an abstract kind of level on this. And the two things that seem to me to be part of the corporate food regime that are among the challenges is the question of money and the question of food as a commodity. So this problem of commodification. And so that's not exactly a question, but if you could sort of help us understand, or help me understand a bit better, if we're going to imagine agroecological production, how do we think clearly about the role of money, other forms of exchange perhaps? You talked about social reciprocity. And how do we think about a right to food in a world where food is a commodity? Or how do we think through that or think beyond it?
Okay, so Paul, yes.
Thanks very much, Haroon. I really appreciated all your thoughts and felt that you did a great job of putting things together. I have two questions or points that I guess I'd like to raise. One thing you touched on briefly, but I think could have given more attention to, and that's the fact that we often talk about how we're going to feed the world. We talk about how much food is going to be needed, but we forget that all of those people who need to eat also need jobs. And right now, something like half the people in the world make a living from agriculture. And so if we're going to move to some other sort of agriculture in the future, then they also need jobs. And I think that's something that is often not paid enough attention to, but we need to think about livelihoods and not just food production. The other point, which isn't entirely disconnected from that, is something that you started with. You said that a couple of years ago, we recently passed the point where more than half the people in the world live in cities, more urbanized. And as we get more and more people in cities than in the countryside, I think naturally we're going to have more people who think as consumers than as producers. And that means that the voting bloc, if you want to call it, is going to be more inclined to go for cheap food rather than things that favor agricultural production, favor jobs on the land, favor environmental sustainability on the land, etc. As you know, in Canada, we've got something less than 2% of people actually farming, and our politics are not really designing around the needs of the farming community, they're designing around the needs of cities. I think we're going to see more of that in the world. It's a question of how do you keep agriculture in the forefront when you're talking to people in high ranks.
Thanks, Paul. And now we'll go to Laura Rance.
I very much appreciated your comments, and just a few things came to mind that as you were discussing, we talked about the fact that there is enough food being produced today to feed the world, and in the world where I live and operate, there's very much a culture of production, and it's fostered very much around this feed the world. We have to feed the world, and we have to produce. If we take that rhetoric or that expression that we could all recite in our sleep, that we have to double the world's food production by such and such a time in order to feed the population, and if we substitute the word production with availability, we start to have a very different conversation. The implications of focusing on production from an environmental and ecological point of view are very, very sinister and insidious, because if you look at what's happening today, much of the production, up to 50% in some countries, is lost. It goes to waste. And you didn't really get to that point. I know you have a lot of territory to cover, but that food waste issue is so pivotal to how we move forward with this, particularly in countries where, as Paul pointed out, the majority of the population who's hungry is also farming. And they lack the infrastructure that even if they do get a good crop and we're able to have surplus, they would benefit from high food prices if they could get it to market. And so there's a real opportunity for economic and social development by very basic applications of technology to provide storage and infrastructure and access to markets, building roads, very important to feeding the world in the future. The other area that I just wondered if you had thoughts on was the whole question of how we're allocating our research and how we're, as a society, I mean, yes, we can talk about the corporatization of agriculture and the food supply, but it's very much a product of us as a society in that we pressure our governments constantly that we do not want higher taxes. And one of the areas where governments have cut back is by saying, well, the private sector can do this research. And when we move to a privately funded research, we are commodifying food to a further extent, in that these companies legitimately have to make a return on investment. And in order to make that return on investment, they have to have something to sell. And increasingly, what they have to sell is embodied in the seed that they're selling. And so we're at a point now where the bulk of the world's seed supply in commodity crops is controlled by 3 or 4 companies. Less than a handful of companies control the seed supply. And so they're determining what we grow, who grows it, how it's grown, and more often than not, that's tied to other products that those companies sell. And I don't want to portray that as an evil, sinister thing, because as I say, that's a product of what we've decided as citizens in our societies, that we don't want to pay for this research, we don't want it to be publicly owned, we want somebody else to pay the bill. And this is what we're getting as a result of that. And so just wondered if you had thoughts around that area.
Okay, thank you very much, respondents. We're actually doing really well for time, so we're going to give Haroon about 10 minutes to respond, and we may have an option to go back to the respondents if you want a rejoinder. So, Haroon, please.
Okay, I'm going to take, I'm going to respond to Paul first, then Laura, then John, the more philosophical, bigger question at the end. Paul's comments, first of all, eaters need jobs. And this is absolutely critical. Over the course of this century, we're going to have to change a lot about how our economic systems operate. And one of the ways in which we're going to have to make some changes as a global society is we're going to have to think about the relationship between work and farming and livelihoods. Currently, most farmers have a very hard time making a living, and that's true that's true in a developing country, or it's true if you've got a section and a quarter 2 hours out of here. It's difficult to make a decent living. And so many farmers also face a very constrained livelihood even out here. The thing about the livelihoods in our food system, though, is that farming constitutes a very small proportion of the livelihoods of those who are enmeshed in the food system. The truth of the matter is we don't know how many people work in the food system because it's not counted. Because where people work in the food system now is they're working in bars, they're driving trucks, they're working in supermarkets, they're doing a whole bunch of other things. They're sitting at this table speaking to you. I'm working in the food system by doing this. Yet none of this is counted. We only think of it as being farmers. A few months ago, I went back to the 2006 census, and I went down to the decomposed categorizations of who's doing what. And I added up manually added up everything that could be attributable directly to the food system. And of the total employed labor force, 14% of the Canadian labor force were directly employed in the food system. And this didn't include people like me who do these sorts of things and therefore might count. They don't include the lawyers that work in the food system. They don't include the people that represent rural communities and constituencies. So the numbers of people that work in the food system are actually extremely significant. In fact, some would argue, I'm not sure I totally agree with it, but some would argue that the food system is the single most significant employer in the country. Now, if this is the case, then the livelihood issue is that many people who work in the food system work in jobs which are relatively low paid or less remunerative. That's true if you're working in a restaurant. That's true if you're trying to grow a crop on a farm. They're very often insecure. They're not unionized. And so there is a livelihood issue at work in our food system that we need to recognize, that many people who work here, whether you're farming, whether you're in the food, other aspects of the food system, you need to be able to make a decent living. Until we offer people working in the food system, including farmers, the chance to make a decent living, people are going to not want to do it. But if you can make a decent living, then I think things change completely. I think a lot of people, if they thought they could raise their family well, raise their children well, and live in a farming community, they'd actually be very happy to give that a go. There's lots of experiments underway in Ontario, which is trying to encourage younger people to intern on farms, to learn how to farm. I know lots of people who have done this. They realize they can't make a go of it, but they also realize that that if they could make a go of it, this would be something that would be quite attractive to them. If we can make work in the food system decent enough so that people can expect a reasonable livelihood from it, I also think, Paul, this changes this nature of people wanting only cheap food, because they're going to have a much more rounded appreciation of the fact that so many people are working in the food system that they also deserve a decent standard of living. The other thing, of course, to mention when you do talk about urban settings is increasingly the amount of food that's being produced by urban agriculture, and that people are growing a lot of food. I don't know, someone that does know told me recently that in Havana, 80% of Havana's food is grown within the boundaries of the city of Havana. That's urban agriculture with a vengeance. But there's many places around the world where there's a lot of urban agriculture. And so increasingly, this divide between town and country, rurality and urbanity is becoming fuzzier. Okay. Laura, totally right. The amount of waste is absolutely phenomenal. And if we were able to save the food that's wasted and direct the food that's wasted to people who are hungry, you immediately eliminate the problem of hunger. So waste is a very fundamental issue. But part of the waste is driven by the kinds of values that we have. You know, I want to choose something, it's got to be disposable, you know, I don't have to hang on to it, if I don't finish it, these are the sorts of values which have been propagated in a neoliberal age in which your choice is your expression of your own power, and it's the only power you've got. And so if I choose to, I don't want to have this anymore, then I'm just going to throw it away. So this issue of waste goes back to the kind of values that we have in our age, which we do have to do something about. The productivist side of it, it is a strong culture in North American farming that you do have to produce as much as is possible because of this mantra, double production by 2050 because we've got to feed the world. There's also, though, a lot of myths around that. It's little known, but this whole assertion that we need to double food production by 2050, if you read the footnotes of the report, it's based upon a caloric intake of 3,300 calories on average a day, which is the globalization of an American diet. So if we globalize an American diet, we need to double food production by 2050. But we all know that there's significant problems in the American diet. I mean, we all know the extent to which diet-related disease causes huge burdens on the American healthcare system. Yeah? So we do have this productionist rhetoric, but sometimes you have to unpack that productionist rhetoric. The issue of research is really important. It is very true that in the past 20 years, agricultural research has been privatized, and that the intellectual property rights regimes that we have, as encompassed within the World Trade Organization General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade Rules, that these encourage the privatization of research. This has led to global seed production be dominated by a few companies, as you quite rightly said, but also global fertilizer production and other agrochemicals being controlled by only a few. There is, though, a global movement which challenges that privatization of seeds, that believes that seeds should not be commodified, but that seeds should be shared, and that we have to learn again how to share seeds. And this also challenges these dominant neoliberal values. And so Via Campesina, the peasant way, one of their central campaigns is around the issue of seed sharing, that people need to start to share their seeds and not have them supplied by these private corporations, because it's part and parcel of what agriculture should be about rather than how it has become. That if we want to shift towards a system where we have a more food sovereign food system, we will have to have a system in which seeds are more locally generated within communities, allowing farmers to make choices which are much more in line with their existing ecologies, rather than shaping environments to fit agriculture, industrial agriculture. Then finally, the issue of commodification. Well, the commodification of food, relentless. The thing about the commodification of food, first of all, it's really important to remember it is really recent. It's recent. Now, food commodification in North America, I mean, to the extent that we have today, this is something which doesn't even go back a century. And if you talk about food commodification in developing countries, the idea that you're producing food strictly to sell, it's even less old than that. So we've had agriculture for about 11,000 years, and for maybe about 100 years we've had food commodification on a very widespread scale. This is something which is a very recent turn of events in global agriculture. And so if it's a very recent turn of events, maybe it's something that can be undone. There's a growing movement around the world that people should have as a basic human right, a right to food. It is embodied in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights that you have a right to food. What does that right to food mean concretely? Well, an economist would say that food would then become a public good, that it is available to you for being a citizen, and that as a public good, you cannot be excluded from it. Now, India has recently passed a right to food law, in which everyone, doesn't matter whether you're rich, doesn't matter whether you're poor, you have a right to a certain amount of grain. If you start establishing basic rights to food, more generally, this is a process by which you start to decommodify some food. And when you start to decommodify some food, you start to value it, I think, in different kinds of ways. In order to do this, we need a different kind of agriculture, as I've said. We need a different kind of food system. We need to place it, we need to have a different set of values. We have a set of values which doesn't say that, markets should organize our society. We need a set of values in which our society should organize our markets. That's the kind of societies we need.
Okay, well that's wonderful. Thank you, respondents, and Haroon. I think we've got about 5 minutes before we want to go to the rest of you all for comments and questions. So if you could maybe start thinking about some questions or comments that you have. I'd like to just take an opportunity to go back to our respondents, and if you'd like to come back at something that you started or that Haroon has responded to, and kind of dig a bit further. Clearly, some of the issues that we're digging into here are financialization, commodification, values, how values are changing, how we are voting, the kinds of governments that we're electing. Some really awesome issues are coming out. But respondents, would Laura, Paul, John, please?
I would just on coming back to the issue of waste. I joke that this makes me a muckraking journalist, but there's two sides to that question, and certainly in our society it's a value-driven discussion, but in other parts of the world it's very much a question of basic infrastructure.
Sure.
And we don't need to come in with high technology to increase production until we know how we can handle the production that people are able to generate. And listening to a speaker from India just recently, they were the recipients of the first green revolution that revolutionized how the productive capacity of that part of the world. They are now a net exporter of wheat, and yet 50% of the children in that country still go hungry. And it's an inability to distribute, and an inability to store, and an inability, and it's basic, very basic needs that are needed. And when we deliver aid and we deliver support, most of the time it's not about that question, it's about something else. So it does come back to values.
I'm glad, Haroon, that you mentioned the food security bill in India. I was just doing a little reading about that today, and some of you are probably aware about this food security bill that is, if it's implemented, it would mean that about 2/3 of people in India would be able to get free or subsidized food, so it does deliver a right to food. However, It is being challenged at the WTO, and there's a WTO meeting this week in Bali in Indonesia. And there's a proposal on the table specifically about this bill. The WTO rules around food specify that, this is an agreement that they came to a few decades ago, that the few rich countries could continue to subsidize their food systems at a certain level, but poorer countries who at that point were not subsidizing their food systems were not allowed to subsidize their food systems. When this was agreed to, in fact, poorer countries really didn't have any money to subsidize their food systems, so it wasn't a big issue. However, since then, as you probably know, India has done very well economically en masse, despite the fact that there's still some very poor people there. Now India has enough money as a country to subsidize food for 2/3 of its people. The WTO is saying, no, you can't do that because you agreed not to 20-some years ago. And so there's a big debate going on this week in Bali about whether the rich countries, in this case specifically the US and Europe, who are the big subsidizers of food, whether they will agree to allow some other countries to subsidize. The ideal might be to have everybody roll back subsidies, or have them roll back subsidies, but that's not likely. So the question is if some of the poorer countries can start to use some of the measures that the rich countries have used all along.
John, did you want to share something?
I mean, I guess kind of building on what Paul just said, Haroon, you pointed to sort of the very short history of the commodification of food, and yet, just the scope of powers and thinking and actors, committed to it, committed to perpetuating it, committed to deepening it. I guess maybe it's my own lack of imagination, but I'm struggling to if we see the commodity, sort of the emergence of thinking clearly about commodities, sort of in the sort of post or since the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe. That's on a little bit longer historical trajectory than what you identified for commodifying food, and so I'm just maybe press you a little bit for this. Like how do you think about food as a different kind of stuff, in a way, or a different sort of, I don't know what else to put it, right? Like how can you help us think about why is the decommodification of food? Why do you see that as A, as possible, but maybe B, as more possible than the decommodification of other things that we think of as, rightly or correctly or appropriately allocated in markets?
Firstly, back to Laura, I totally agree. In many parts of the world, you need basic storage, basic infrastructure, because that's one of the reasons why in many parts of the world there's so much waste. Yeah, and certainly India is the case that is well known to be the best. The amount of food that is wasted in India is remarkably large, and that's all down to a lack of storage facilities. So yes, I mean, it's very, very true. Let's connect Paul and John's together, I think. In the modern world, as it's currently constituted, you obtain a right to food with money. Without money, you do not have a right to food. Now, this is the reason why Via Campesina argues that we don't want to think about something called food security. We want to think about something called food sovereignty. Because food security as an idea says nothing at all about the terms and conditions by which food is produced. It says nothing at all about how that food has been produced, who has produced that food. And these are precisely the issues which for Via Campesina are absolutely central. That for smallholder farmers, that they should be free to choose to produce what they think is important using appropriate technologies, and be paid prices for their products that reflect their cost of production rather than world market prices. That people, as consumers, have a right to be properly informed about the food that they're eating so that they actually can make better decisions. That if you are going to institute the right of farmers to choose to how they want to produce and what they want to produce, there will have to be the protection of national agriculture from internationally dumped food on the world market, which means you will have to have mechanisms by which national agricultures can be protected. Now, how can we imagine this kind of a world? We can imagine this kind of a world because it's being built in front of our eyes. Via Campesina is the largest social movement in the world. Whether you accept their own figure, that they've got 200 million affiliated members across the various organizations which they follow, or whether you say it's 100 million members, or let's even say it's 50 million members, it's still the biggest social organization in the world. And it's not as if they don't have an impact. Only in the past 2 months, the Food and Agriculture Organization has started to use the language of food sovereignty. And it said that Via Campesina has to be consulted now when we start talking about agricultural negotiations, because they're the representatives of global smallholder farmers. We see in our communities, we see young people wanting to give farming a try, very sympathetic to this idea that people should have a right to food that is not mediated by money, yeah, but a right to grow what they can grow, so that they can try and think about their own values in a different kind of way. A right to express their own individual food sovereignty. So it's not just Via Campesina, it's not just food consumers that we have who are trying to be producers in various parts of Canada, in Southern Ontario, which of course I know the best, or in Vermont, or in Washington State, where legislation to identify genetically modified organisms in food was only recently didn't pass in a statewide vote because of lobbying from the food industry. People are trying to build it. Yeah, we do know that food security as an approach, with that central role of money in obtaining your right to food, this has produced a disaster, and that is a food system which degrades the planet, which ejects people from the countryside and generates systemic hunger. And people are trying to change that. And that's where I can see the struggle against commodification taking place. It's happening. Yeah? It's happening with the MST. It's happening with farmers all over the world. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, respondents and Haroon. So now we'd like to hear from you. Your comments, questions. We have microphones at the bottom. Alternatively, I'll bring the microphone up. If you raise your hand, what are you thinking? What are your thoughts? What are your comments, questions? We moved from the point about population quite early on in Haroon's presentation into the corporatization of agriculture, and then the panel kind of picked up on that issue and talked about, where is that coming from? Is it coming from corporations, or is it coming from citizens who are giving up or providing less to governments? So, questions or comments? Who can start us off?
Hi, I'm going to be brave number one. First of all, thank you very much for your talk, and I have a bit of a challenge, I guess. First, I'll state my bias. I'm a reformed vegetarian. I like to call myself a conscientious omnivore. So one of the arguments that I hear often by environmentalists, and again tonight was this meatification argument, which I have to take issue with, because when I hear this argument, I feel like it's very simplistic, and that it disempowers people who are trying to be, responsible producers, trying to employ techniques of biomimicry in their agroecological production, and people who are trying to promote traditional diets. And in a lot of traditional diets, meat is a very important and sacred thing. So I guess if I was trying to come up with a way to ask a question about that, I might ask, do you think that it muddies or overcomplicates the argument of environmentalists when talking to policymakers to try and, I guess, portray the complexities of meat production, and how can we more clearly, talk about food production that includes meat in a way that doesn't only portray it as something negative in the environment.
I actually think we're probably on the same page. So I'm not turning around and saying, everyone in this room stop eating meat. Bad, 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 bad. I'm not saying that. One of the things I do say to my students is if you want to do one thing for the food system, one thing for the environment, which is an everyday thing, it's very straightforward. Eat less meat, number one. Number two, take far more time to think about where it comes from and how it has been raised. Because the problem isn't having meat in the diet per se. I mean, after all, we actually are, a meat-consuming species. The issue is the volume of it, the sheer quantity of it, and the fact that we consume something where we don't take into account the full environmental costs of the meat that we are consuming. Okay? So it's not a question the responsible way of approaching the issue of meat consumption is to recognize that we eat too much of it. It's not to say you stop eating it, yeah? But it's also a question of thinking about how it's sourced. We just don't pay attention to the act of cruelty that is at the center of the way in which commodity meat is entering into our food chain and reaching our supermarkets, and sometimes far too frequently bearing pathogens that will kill us. Yeah? So we need to pay far more attention to that, yeah? Especially environmental costs. There was an Indian Research Institute several years ago. They produced a study in which they said that if you took the full ecological cost into account, a hamburger should cost $200. Well, I can't find that study. Lord knows I tried to find it. Yeah? It sounds like an awful lot to me. But I certainly do think that the environmental cost of meat is much more significant than the private price that we pay for it. Yeah? Because all that methane, warming the planet. So that's how I'd answer that.
Laura, did you want to share?
I would just say too, from an environmental perspective, that the issue that livestock has been an integral part of agriculture from time immemorial, and in traditional agriculture, it was part of a recycle. It was part of a cycle where the farmer, even if he was growing annual crops, had a portion of his land that was devoted to raising livestock, and the livestock were fed grains from the farm, the manure from the livestock went back to the land, and it was, I would argue, a more environmentally benign in terms of water, because the manure on the land stayed on the land, the nutrients stayed and produced more, and essentially livestock allow us as humans to convert the sun's energy through grasses into food that we can consume. And if you look historically on the prairies, there were ruminants roaming these prairies for centuries prior to us coming here and replacing those bison with cattle. So they are part of a functioning ecosystem. Where we run into problems is when we take those animals and we intensify them, and we put all of those nutrients in one small area that cannot be appropriately distributed back onto the land. And when we look at the issue of phosphorus contamination, phosphorus and nitrogen contamination of Lake Winnipeg, for example, that can't all be placed on the backs of agriculture or on hog production. But we do have pockets of Manitoba where, because of the way the industry was regulated, we did see an accumulation of phosphorus that turned a non-renewable and a much-needed nutrient into a contaminant. Phosphorus is a non-renewable and fertilizer that, we only have so much of it in the world. We talk, there's discussions about peak phosphorus, just as we talked about peak oil. And yet what we do in agriculture and is we take that much needed nutrient and we turn it into a pollutant in our lakes because we're pumping it out. If that was managed in such a way that it was applied to the land as needed through less intensive livestock production, I would argue, and less intensive agriculture, we wouldn't have the same issues that we have with the environmental impact of livestock. But I would agree with Haroon. I mean, it's if we lived according to what our doctors say we should be eating, meat would be a delicacy. And the pressure, again, of this production culture, we have to produce this beef at a low price. We all have to have a Big Mac 3 times a week. That's not good for us, it's not good for the environment, it's definitely not good for the cow.
And it's not good for conscientious omnivores.
No.
Okay, more questions?
I'm going to try to, I've written notes all over the place, so I'll try to synthesize them. Laura, you mentioned the act of sort of, as voters, we vote for the party that will guarantee us the lowest taxes, and then we give up our ability to participate in democracy that way and allow private corporate companies to come in and control the food system, and then we say, oh, well, we'll vote with our dollar, and we just won't buy whatever the private researchers have done that we don't agree with. But the problem is we don't have the information to make an informed vote with that dollar, right, when we get to the grocery store. So in particular, there are lots of different issues with neoliberal policies, but I'm mostly curious about the ways in which, let's say, farmers in Manitoba are directly affected by these policies in more abstract ways, in terms of having a problem accessing markets because there are restrictions on what you can and cannot sell. There aren't processors available to deal with certain products because it's not seen as economically viable, and therefore there's nobody in that market. So an example is a decreasing number of abattoirs in Canada as a whole. So I'm wondering, we're talking about food sovereignty, we're talking about neoliberalism. To me, those two seem mutually exclusive. And I'm curious about ways of working, I guess what I see is towards food sovereignty and away from neoliberalism. If things that encourage food sovereignty automatically work against neoliberalism, or if they're two separate battles that need to be fought.
Who wants to start? That's a big question. Haroon, are you going to?
The thing about a modern capitalist economy such as ours is that we're raised on the mantra of choice, but in fact our choices are pretty restricted. Our freedoms are pretty restricted, because you can walk into a supermarket and you can choose from tens of meters of breakfast cereals, but the vast bulk of them are produced by only a few companies, and they're just shoveling sugar into you to give you a sugar fix. When you start talking about whether food sovereignty as a personal or intellectual or political position, where does it stand in relation to neoliberalism? For the most part, I would argue that it is very fundamentally opposed to the way in which the current food regime operates, and that is a very fundamentally neoliberal food regime. And so food sovereignty, in terms of an approach to trying to secure a right to food, is very much against the way in which the current food system works in its neoliberal corporate form, arguing that it's highly undemocratic, that it exploits smallholder farmers, that it exploits workers, and it exploits consumers. And therefore this food system has to be struggled against in whatever way is best for the circumstances that you're in. The next speaker actually in the series, Nettie Vive, I mean, she has a farm outside Regina, outside Saskatoon rather, in which she tries to practice food sovereignty. They raise their animals in a humane way. They grow their crops organically. They're certified organic. And they do engage with markets, but they try and engage with markets on their own terms, rather than on terms set to them by larger food corporations. Of course, the reality of the modern food system is they're only able to do this by having more than one job. They have to have the outside income coming in order to be able to do that. But that's the kind of example of what people are trying to do, and they're trying to do it all over the country. All over the country, people are trying to construct an alternative from the ground up.
Yeah, Laura, please.
I'll just offer maybe a concrete example of the kinds of dilemmas that we face, and it's related to the new free trade agreement that Canada is working on with Europe, and it's getting a lot of press, and Stephen Harper needed to have something good to talk about, I think, and I think that there's a lot of interest in improving trade, and trade relations, but for an industry like our beef industry in Manitoba and on the prairies, philosophically, cattle producers are very pro-free trade, and they're very much celebrating this potential agreement as an opportunity to expand their exports of beef to Europe. But the reality is that Europe will not accept beef that has been produced with the use of growth hormones.
Yes.
And our industry has embraced that technology for probably 30 years or so. There's controversy about it, but it's been tested, and it's the same as the GM. I mean, officially, it's considered to be an approved production practice. And when we're in a culture of production, the idea is that these products, these growth hormones, will increase their productivity, their efficiency, by 20 to 30%. That's very well documented. So for a producer who's looking at taking advantage of these new opportunities to sell to Europe, he has to go against the whole industry mantra here. He has to give up 20 to 30% of his production efficiency and probably open up market channels to get there. And it's very much in question as to whether or not the prices that he's going to be paid for doing all that are going to compensate him for what he could get going through traditional commodity market channels here. So, with country of origin labeling and some of the issues regarding that to the traditional market into the US, more farmers may be looking at this. But that's the dilemma that they face, is if they want to access this great new market, they're going to have to give up quite a bit of hardcore production to do that. And they are cultured to believe, we all are, that we have to produce more all the time.
Hi there, my name is Laura as well. And I was thinking about, in the spirit of John's sort of more philosophy question. You mentioned that one of the things people entering sort of farming occupations is that they can't necessarily imagine themselves sort of living, having a decent living, and how some people are starting to view that. But my question is, do you think that we need to then therefore sort of reimagine what it means, what decent means in this context, what well means? Because just as Laura said, we are in this is also different from sort of a local context to a more global idea, but if we live here in a sort of culture of more, and a decent living is, living in the suburbs with 3 cars and 2 kids and, that kind of idea, then that's not possible with this idea of going back to farming. So do we need to reimagine that, and what might that look like, is my tiny little question.
Good question. Yes. Who wants to take that one? It's a big one. John, do you want to?
I'm no expert on this, but it's certainly a question that I have pondered. As I think about some of the income figures around the world, I don't know what average incomes are in Canada. Somebody here may know, but I expect average incomes are what, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, something like that. And of course, in many parts of the world, they are, in the range of a few $100s per year. And so there is one thought that everybody in the world wants to be as rich as we are. And you won't actually achieve happiness in the world unless everybody is as rich as us. But just imagine what that would mean in terms of resource use if everybody in the world was making as much money as we are on average in Canada. And so I've looked kind of at statistics of what does it take to make people happy. And there is good surveys around the world on levels of happiness. And it shows that for very poor people, level of happiness rises with income up to a certain level. Once you reach around $10,000 or $12,000 a year, level of happiness does not increase anymore with income. So that doesn't quite get at your question of what's a decent life, but it certainly gets at some of the questions of what would make people happy and what would be an average sort of something that we could achieve on average in the world that would increase the level of satisfaction. And it may give you some idea of what we should be striving for is not to have everybody having 3 cars in the suburbs, but to have some means of moving the world towards a system where a lot of us scale way back on what we are earning and what we are using, while at the same time trying to increase resource availability to those who are currently poorest.
I mean, I know Laura's heard probably everything I have to say on this topic as one of my students, but I mean, it's E.F. Schumacher who said it. He said, in a way, in the strictest economic terms, we should strive to maximize happiness with the least amount of stuff. Like, that would be happiness efficiency. I mean, he says it a little bit tongue-in-cheek, I think, but also in a very serious way, right? Where we start to rethink that calculus, if you will, that calculus of decent living, that calculus of satisfaction, that calculus of well-being. Because if it takes a lot of, if you have to supply a lot of things for a certain level of happiness, it's a very inefficient kind of system, and sort of the very strictest kind of cost-benefit sort of way of approaching it. I mean, as I say, Schumacher, I think, says it in a certain amount of tongue-in-cheek, but at least to pose that question about what is enough, intimately connected to the question of what it means to live well.
As most people would probably be aware, I mean, Spain has undergone a period of immense austerity over the course of the past 5 years. And basically, if you're someone your age, your chances of getting a job in Spain are pretty well nothing. There's zero. There's no future. And if you talk to Spaniards, the degree of pessimism is quite remarkable. There's 20,000 Portuguese a year moving to Mozambique because their opportunities are greater in Mozambique than they are in Portugal. Well, the European Union has got a common agricultural policy which very strongly micromanages farming. But one of the things that the Basque Farmers Union has found is that if small groups of people who don't have jobs and don't have a future go out and start to try and farm, and the Farmers Union helps them out, 2 people working a hectare of land with a 10-person CSA are able to manage far better than they can right now in an urban area. And so this is an example of farming offering a livelihood for people in the most straitened circumstances under conditions of severe economic austerity. Now, if that happens in these sorts of conditions, that people can reimagine a future which is very different, then you can reimagine a future where it's not 3 cars in the driveway. Yeah? That there are alternatives, and as I've said, people are doing this day in and day out.
Any final comments? What?
Oh, go ahead, you want to.
I'll talk about waste again. But, we all heard this expression growing up, eat the food on your plate because there's starving people in Africa or there's starving people in China. I always used to think, well, send it to them then, But, when we waste food, when it goes to waste in our fridge or when we throw food out or, we go to those buffets where it's all you can eat and you just dump it off your plate and people get more, we really are hurting people in other parts of the world who don't have enough. Because the food that we're eating has been produced with the benefit of non-renewable resources. And we're consuming those resources. The fertilizer, nitrogen, nitrogen's renewable, but phosphorus, energy that goes into our food production system, our food production and handling system, our just-in-time delivery system, the fruits and vegetables that come here from California on a truck, they go rotten in our refrigerator. We have consumed that energy, and it's not available to somebody else who needs it. And to the extent that this stuff ends up in our landfill sites, and it's producing methane and other greenhouse gases, we are polluting the world as well. So, there's choices that we can make that don't seem tangible in terms of helping other people. But to the extent that we are consuming these resources and then throwing them away, it comes back to creating a better world for everybody by changing how we approach what we do on a day-to-day basis.
I wasn't sure. Is there one final question?
Yeah. Thanks. Hey, my name is Susie. And the question that I had is just around kind of the increase in organic agriculture that's available in the market. One of the things that I'm interested in kind of as a research area is the way that capitalist systems kind of subsume protest. And so I guess the question that I have is around basically if this is something that's happening with organic agriculture, like if the availability of organic food in our supermarkets is actually kind of as a token alternative to the food system, but one that's only really available to kind of the elite, is actually in effect kind of having a negative effect on the amount that people might otherwise be protesting about the food system.
Another myth, organic equals sustainable. This is simply not the case. Just as inorganic equals unsustainable. This is just simply not the case. Yeah? If you buy organic leaf in Canada, 80% of the organic leaf that's sold in this country comes from one company which is growing that leaf in California in a desert where the water is being pumped, hundreds of miles. And we see the word organic on it, we think, fine, that's great. This is just another way in which a highly unsustainable farm production system is being recreated in order to fill a market niche so that you will spend your dollars on a higher value product. Okay? And that's why you have to unpack these things. I mean, we have a student-run cooperative cafe in my university, and they do a really good job of trying to source locally and things like that. And you go into the refrigerator when you're having a coffee and you want to use some soy milk, and you point out that the soy milk's made from genetically modified soy, and they don't know because of course it's not labeled. Yeah? But of course it's soy milk, it's much better. Blah, blah. So without knowledge, consumers simply aren't able to make informed choices at all.
Okay, I think at that point I'm going to wrap it up, and if you could just join me in thanking Haroon and the respondents once again. And if I could just make a couple of plugs, as Haroon has mentioned, thank you, by the way, our next speaker is Dr. Nettie Wiebe, and she'll be here on January 23rd speaking on the topic of This Land is Our Land, Reintegrating Earth, Eating, and Ethics. And anyone here who is a student and interested in taking another course in the winter term, we have 3 courses, 2 at Menno Simons on this topic, food security, farm sustainability, 1 at the Shaftesbury campus of Canadian Mennonite University. So if you're interested, come and talk to me or one of the faculty at the refreshment hour right now. And I think that's it. So thank you very much for coming and hope to see you again.